Welcome to the Social Science Club, and today I'm going to be doing a little video on writing a psychology research report. And while it's focused around psychology, the general style and method of writing a research report is largely transferable across disciplines, although there may be some miniature which you need to be aware of. So just double check if you're doing a non-psychological report. So the typical research report structure has layers, as you can see by this cookie-looking metaphor. The first layer of a report structure is the abstract. This is the first part that a reader would see. And then once you have the abstract, then you go into an introduction. I'm going to go over all of these different sections in a bit more detail, but I'm just giving you an overview of what the report structure would look like. So after the introduction, then you have the methods, which has subsections such as information on the participants used, the design of the study, is it differences, is it correlational, the apparatus and materials used, so if you did a survey, what measures were included in that survey, and then the overall procedure of how it was undertaken. Once you've discussed the methods used, then you will go on to the actual results. What are your statistical outcomes based on the design of the study that you mentioned earlier? And once you have your results, then you would have the discussion and the conclusion. And then finally, you would have your references and appendices. So let's go into a little bit more detail on each of these sections. Before you actually get to the abstract, you would have your report title. This is a concise and insightful sentence or line that provides insight into the investigation that's being reported. So what are you actually writing about? Generally, the title would include the independent variables and the dependent variables. And this entices the reader into looking further into the report, either if it's something that they're specifically interested in, or if they're looking for some literature for their own research, and maybe you can get a citation out of it. So some characteristics of an effective title. An effective title would accurately indicate the subject and the scope of the study. It identifies key variables, as I mentioned, both the dependent and independent variable. If you have a multitude of independent variables, then you would focus specifically on the main investigative points of your research. Mentioning the variables suggests some type of relationship between the variables which support the major hypothesis of your study. Generally, you want to exclude the study of, analysis of, or similar constructions. Rather, you want to phrase it in a way that encapsulates the relationship between these variables. And titles are usually in the form of a phrase, but can also be in the form of a question. And you need to make sure that you use the correct grammar and capitalization required. Some journals would have, or if you're focusing on a journal, some journals would have specific requirements on how that title will be capitalized. So again, double check. So let's go on to the abstract. An abstract is essentially a brief statement of the problem that is being investigated. It includes aspects such as the design used, again, differences, correlational, experimental. You give information on the participant. The details of the participants is quite important to determining exactly how valid, reliable, and generalizable a study might be. For instance, you could argue that 20 males and 20 females were the sample that was used in the study. And then you need to include the stimulus materials used, such as the experiments and other important apparatus. You want to outline the main results briefly, the main conclusions, and the nature of the discussion. And perhaps if you're using a theoretical basis, you want to reference that key theory or piece of research if the study is based on perhaps a replication of another study. So here's an example of what an abstract might look like. So we have some sections such as the problem statement, the background, the objective, research question, and definition. And each of these sections is approximately one line long, or one sentence long rather. So the problem statement in this example of an abstract would be that environmental non-profit organizations in the United Kingdom currently face a significant funding gap. So that right away you are alerted to the fact that this is a problem and this is what the research will be focusing on. Then you have a background, so what does the previous literature tell you about this phenomena? And then you go on to your objective. So this study aims to determine how environmental organizations can target fundraising campaigns to increase donations. So that is the objective of this research, and it's very clear in the first 3 sentences what this research will be focusing on. Then you have your own research question. To what extent does a potential donor's social distance from climate change victims and fundraising campaigns affect their intention to make a donation? So then we get more specific about what the actual research question, what this research will be focusing on. Then you can give, again, a bit more definition of what the phenomena and concepts are going to be used in the research. So in this context, social distance is defined as the extent to which people feel that they are in the same social group, an in-group, or another social group, an out-group, in relation to climate change victims. And then you go on and you provide some methodological information, the main results, and a conclusion to your study. So this is in essence the structure of a good abstract. So once you have your abstract done, then you would move on to your introduction. So when you're actually writing your report, you may not follow the same structure as you go along, but the final product needs to follow a similar structure to what I'm reporting about now. So for instance, your abstract might only be done right towards the end, but it always needs to come right after the title of the research and the actual report. An introduction is perhaps one of the most difficult parts of a report to get right, because it needs to kind of hook the reader in, and as well as be concise and informative. So you could say that the introduction should contain a review of the relevant background material, including existing theories and key findings, so essentially what it's composed of as a literature review. You need to focus on the exact problem to be researched and the research hypotheses. In line with the hypotheses, you want to outline your expected results. What do you expect to find once you have conducted the research? I haven't included this on the page, but you also want to focus on what will your research contribute to the overall literature on the subject. This is particularly important when submitting your paper for perhaps a publication, because the reviewers want to know what's so important about your research. So you could take the funnel approach to an introduction, and as well as the literature review as a whole. So you want to start broad and become narrower as you reach your research hypotheses. As an example, you can include 3 to 6 pieces of previous research or theories, and references from peer-reviewed journals and books are more credible and provide more weight to your argument than internet-based sources. This is particularly important if you're writing this report in an academic sense, so you want to avoid all types of non-academic literature as much as possible, because that peer review process generally implies that what you're reading is a validated and empirically validated result and not someone's, I suppose, own opinion on the matter. So as you narrow down from a broad theory to more particular research and then your own hypotheses, you need to also make sure that you're listing how your research will be different from what has previously been done before. It's quite important in the introduction, as I said, to highlight these different aspects and to hook your reader in as to why they should continue reading and not move on to a different, I suppose, publication or report. So then you have the method. So the method is essentially a section to explain the rationale behind your chosen means of collecting data. Indeed, the method should be one of the first sections of the report that is written up immediately after the study is finished, so everything that you have done in the report is still fresh in your mind. The method should contain sufficient information for the reader to understand and, importantly, be able to replicate your study exactly as you did. So there's this phenomenon in psychology, particularly in psychology, called the replicability crisis, where a study may be done and find some interesting results, but then another study which follows the same methods as the previous study finds different results. A large part of the credibility of research is being able to find the same result using the same methods before. So it's important to have a very detailed, as much as possible, method and design section. So overall the method is split into following principal sections, and these include the participants, the design, the materials, and the procedure, as well as ethical requirements. So the method design. So the design should state the following. So the type of design that was used. So was it an independent design? Was it a paired design? Mixed or matched subjects? Was it differences? Was it correlational? Was it perhaps a factor analysis? These are all important aspects that need to be discussed and highlighted in the design section of the methods. You want to clearly state which independent variables you used, as well as if they're categorical, what their different levels are, and as well as the dependent variables, including the level of measurement. So again, were they categorical, are they scale, are they ratio, are they probabilities? These all need to be highlighted and put down very clearly. So as I mentioned earlier, participants' information is quite important to research because the sample that you use may have an impact on the generalizability of your outcomes. So some information includes the number of participants, because a study that uses a small sample size is less likely to be as reliable as a study that uses a very large sample size. So that needs to be highlighted. The sampling method, so did you use a random sampling method or did you use a more convenience method? So random sampling versus non-random sampling. Some demographic information, so what are the characteristics of the participants that you use in your study? And any other study specific criteria that were included. So if you did a control versus experimental group and you had a healthy group and versus an experimental group that had perhaps some type of disorder such as asphyxia or sphasia, then you need to include what were the recruitment criteria, what were the specific criteria for including them in the study or excluding them if they didn't meet that criteria. And similar to the sampling method, how were the participants recruited? So did you have access to a hospital? Did you go onto an online forum and recruit, or was it social media? This all needs to be detailed. So then the materials, so essentially what measures and scales and experiments and tasks did you use in your study? And it's important to also illustrate the previous validity and reliability of these measures if they were previously used in other research. So some scales and questionnaires, if those were used, how were the scales used? So did you use a standardized scoring method or did you use some alternative scoring methods? So what exactly did the scales measure? So relate this back to your dependent and independent variables. You can also put some examples of the items on the scale, although this might also be done in an appendix. Detail how the participants responded, such as an online survey or was it a written task. Again, looking at your word limit, you can detail more information perhaps in a dissertation or a thesis as you could in a very short journal report. So if you have the word count to include additional information such as the scoring of the measures, then I would recommend doing so, but if you have a limitation, then you need to try and prioritize what the most important sections would be to include. So then the procedure, so how was the actual study carried out? So it describes the procedure is like the instructions for perhaps baking a cake or making something from Lego. It describes exactly what was done in the study, how participants were instructed, whether standardized instructions were used, for instance a script and debrief form, and the order in which things were done. So this procedure needs to be logical, insightful, and contain sufficient information for the reader to follow, and again to replicate if that was the intention. So once you have the introduction and the method section done, then the following section is generally the results. So the result is essentially the revised version of your statistical or qualitative analysis. Here we want to report the key findings, a clear and concise summary of the data that was collected and the results of any statistical tests. Each statistical test has its own format for reporting, which should be adhered to. For instance, independent sample t-test versus ANOVA versus regression. These all need to be followed according to generally, in psychology, the APA standard. It's also important to know that if you are reporting outcomes in a paragraph format versus a table format, you only want to have one. So don't report, I suppose, for example, means and standard deviations of a measure in a table and then reiterate those exact same means and standard deviations in a paragraph. What you can do is refer in a paragraph format to the table above or table below, which contains the information. And include graphs only if they add to the understanding or the intuitive interpretation of the outcomes. So don't just include graphs for the sake of having some figures and images, but rather only include them if they actually add something important to the report. The results section always starts with some descriptive stats on the characteristics of the sample you've recruited and how they all scored on the different measures. So just some means and standard deviations, and if you're using non-parametric, then you would do the median and the range. And this is always done before you report any statistical test. So again, you can use graphs where they are meaningful, such as showing, for instance, a scatter plot of the correlation of outcomes. And then, you want to report the statistical tests that have been used in the study. Again, these will follow specific formats and depending on journal and discipline. So APA for psychology, and generally APA is used in most psychology-related papers. But for other reports, different styles might be used. So once you've finished your results, then you move on to your discussion. So essentially, you've introduced the theory, you've discussed how you'll be testing it, you show what your results were, and now you want to discuss what your results were, again in contrast to the previous theory as well. So the discussion enables the interpretation and the explanation of the study results. The results should be related back to the research studies discussed in the introduction, and if you're testing a theory, how do your results relate to the theory? Do they support it, or do they stand in contrast to it? Again, you want to discuss any limitations with the current study and provide a rationale for future studies. So what are some things that you identified that limited your work, and what would you recommend that the next steps for investigating a similar type of phenomenon are in future studies? And you also want to give an overall discussion on whether the results supported your experimental or null hypothesis. Do your findings support the literature, or do they stand in contrast to it? Were your findings predicted by the literature? How does your research add to the literature? Again, you need to focus on your contribution, particularly in journal publications. So if your findings differed from your expectations, are there any possible explanations why? Could your limitations have influenced this? Does the particular theory or model you have used still hold true in light of your research? And if the theory or model seems flawed, then how can it be refined in light of your own findings? You want to start from going from a very specific introduction, so reintroduce what your study was about, restate your hypothesis that you were doing, why you were looking at it, and what you were looking at. And then if you found a relationship or a difference, what does this mean, and does it support other research? Does it support your hypothesis, or does it stand in contrast to it? After that, you want to conclude by summarizing what you did and what you found, and overall what it means. So essentially, your conclusion could be the, analogous abstract to your discussion. The discussion is really the heart of your report. So it takes into account what was done before, what you found, and how your findings relate to the previous literature and future directions future studies can take. A little structure that you can use in the discussion. So discuss the results of the current study, explaining exactly what was found. Avoid using numbers. You don't want to report statistics twice. So you report statistics or numbers in the results section, but your discussion focuses only on a discourse on those results and not reporting them twice. Account for the findings of your research, relate back to the previous research and theories highlighted in the introduction. There's no point in including theories and literature in the introduction or the literature review if you're not going to refer to them based on your discussion again. So you need to bring those theories back and relate them to your own research findings. And then finally discuss the limitations of the current study and provide ideas for future research, and again end with your conclusion summarizing the overall findings and research question. Right at the end you have your references and then your appendix. So again, depending on the discipline and journal you might be attempting to publish in, you need to have a specific style such as American Psychological Association or Harvard style. References are at the end of the report and before the appendices, and they must be consistent with the text. What I mean by that is that if you cite an author, that author must be referenced and included in the reference list. And then the appendix, here's where you include all of the, if you want appropriate statistical analysis output, if you have additional tables and graphs which you don't think are as important to include in the main report but are still interesting for readers to go through if they felt like it. You can also include any discussions on normality of your data and the criteria that you use to account for that. And in certain reports you may want to include the materials used or the ethics documentation, such as the study information sheet, the debrief, consents, the scales, and participant recruitment documents. So in a journal publication you wouldn't include all this, but in, I suppose, an undergraduate or graduate report, these will be useful items to include. So just some general formatting rules for report writing. Reports should be double-spaced. Each major section, such as the abstract, the introduction, the methods, results, and discussion, should be in bold. Each minor section, such as participants and the subsection of the methods, should be in italics. All pages should be numbered. And the last section is the appendix and includes some raw data, ethical approval form, and other relevant information. Again, so what you might include in the appendix varies from institution to institution and what your actual objective of the report might be. So you'll need to double check that. Some report writing tips: you want to start writing early. Important details about the study may be forgotten if the write-up is left to the last minute. So in line with that, keep some notes on what you've done. Remember, a naive reader should be able to follow your report and replicate your findings. So a tip that was once given to me, which just kind of stuck with me, is that when you're writing a research report, consider your reader to be intelligent but uninformed. They need to be able to find the relevant information in the text that you have and make sense of it. Reading journal articles and past dissertations will help you with structuring your report and understanding the required style. And lastly, reflect. Reflect upon the comments you receive on your practical report and your essays. These are provided to help you. So be able to take some criticism. If you have a supervisor or a reviewer, their objective is not to bring you down, but rather to help you achieve the best possible outcome. So if you want to assess your report, go over a sort of checklist. So does your abstract give a clear idea of what is in the report? Do you include background theory? Do you include your own results and all the different points mentioned earlier? In your introduction, have you introduced your research adequately? Have you got a clearly constructed and suitable research question or hypotheses, which lead to a set of clear and related subsidiary questions and objectives? Have you managed to identify and get hold of the work of key writers in your particular area? Have you ensured that you have paid due attention to the classic sources? Have you made sure that you have used a variety of sources and read enough work so that you're not too reliant on just a few certain authors? Is it clear how your research relates to previous work? So what do you contribute to the previous work and how has that informed what you're now doing? And have you taken an analytical approach to your literature review? So do you merely identify and describe theories and outcomes with no real critical edge? And generally, have you been analytical enough in reviewing this previous literature? So remember, you need to have an opinion on what's happening, and you need to back that opinion up. So if you disagree with theory, you need to provide evidence to back up any opinion that you may put forward. So methodology, you need to go through whether you have the research design choice has been identified and explained. The research methods need to be justified. Participants need to be detailed. So data collection means need to be justified. The reader should be able to replicate the study based on the information you provided. So we read through it and check if there's any steps that have been missed out. And then brief discussion on the strengths and limitations of the methodology within the method section. So going over some quick tips on going over discussion, results, and conclusion. So have your results been presented clearly, tables and graphs if you use them? Have you used the correct statistical tests and interpreted the results correctly? Have you related previously discussed literature findings to your own results? Are your arguments consistent with the study evidence? You need to acknowledge if you find anything that is contradictory with previous outcomes or theories, and overall discuss your strengths and limitations. And that's it. Good luck with your report writing, whether it be for an undergrad, graduate, or journal paper. And if you found this video helpful, give it a like, maybe subscribe to the channel. It inspires me to make new content. Thank you.